Dr. Chad Scott had spent years as a therapist, sitting with trauma, anxiety, addiction, and the criminal mind, helping other people climb out of difficult places. But nothing prepared him for the moment that his world collapsed.
I was absolutely rock bottom in my life. I was diagnosed with end-stage liver disease, severe cirrhosis, and, really was struggling.
But the therapist in him did something unexpected. He didn't shy away from the darkness. He walked towards it, visiting Auschwitz, Hiroshima, the catacombs of Paris, places marked by immense suffering.
It just felt like a gut punch over and over and over and over. And when you face darkness head on, that is the quickest way to getting through it. It helps you to become much more emotionally intelligent, I think, when you go through these things with reverence and empathy.
He realized that the same revelations that he found in these sites of suffering were the same ones that his patients needed as well.
It kind of just came to my awareness, like, oh my God, these places really helped me, and I needed to tell people about that.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of No Ordinary Monday. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, Chris Barron, and each week I sit down with a guest whose stories are anything but ordinary. We're going to explore their path into the job, what it's really like behind the scenes, and then they're going to relive the wildest, most unforgettable experience of their career. All right, so before we dive in, just a very quick reminder, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the show. If you do, you'll be getting the most extraordinary stories delivered to you for free each week. So far, we've had everything from cave explorers to parapsychologists, Secret Service agents, and we've got a ton of exciting guests already lining up for the coming months. Now, if you have a story or there's a particular career or profession that you want to be featured, you can drop me an email, hello, HELLO, at noordinarymonday.com. And finally, for links and info to the guests, check out the website at noordinarymonday.com, or you can check out the show notes as well for each episode. Now, today's guest is Dr. Chad Scott, a psychologist, therapist, and author who has spent 25 years working with people at their lowest moments. But when Chad's own life collapsed through illness, anxiety, and loss, he found himself searching for answers in places that most of us would avoid. And what he discovered there transformed him. In this conversation, Chad explains why walking through the world's darkest sites with respect and reverence helped him understand suffering in a completely new way. And in his feature story, he relives how a moment inside one of the most haunting historical sites on Earth reshaped the way that he teaches his patients to face their own darkness. You're listening to No Ordinary Monday. Let's get into the show. Bro, Chad, welcome to the podcast. How you doing today, man?
Hey, Chris, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
No worries, it's all pleasure. Where in the world are you dialing from today?
I am in the United States. I'm in northern Minnesota, a little north of Duluth and a little south of the Canadian border.
Honest, I did hear a little bit of the twang in your accent there. Is he Canadian?
Yeah.
Listen, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really was interested to have you on, just because a lot of my guests have got all kinds of career backgrounds, but you've had such a fascinating, meandering journey to get where you are today, with through like touching on like being a miner and getting an education and criminal psychology and now being a therapist and now in dark tourism. And I mean, I just want to start things off like with, try and think back to 18-year-old Chad and if he was looking at what you've got up to now, what would he be thinking?
I never in a million years when I was 18 would have thought I would get a doctorate and taught university psychology and have been a therapist for however many, I've been in the mental health field for 25 years now. No way on earth. I went to college because I didn't really have a plan after high school. So I'm like, well, I might as well just go to college where my girlfriend's going to college. So I followed her to college, and I thought, like, well, what could be something I'd be interested in? Well, maybe I'll be a gym teacher, play floor hockey all day, shoot basketballs, that'd be great. I was a complete sports nut. I played hockey, football, baseball year round.
Oh, nice.
And played some college sports. And while I was in college, I did terrible in regular primary school. I had no interest in school. I had, my parents really pushed sports more than school, really. And, they probably thought same as me, as like, well, school's not my thing. But anyway, when I was in college, you kind of have a fresh start, and you're forced to take classes that you otherwise wouldn't take. So I was taking some social science, anthropology, psychology, sociology, and I just fell in love with the field. So, and at that time I wanted to be, I had started taking flying lessons because I've always wanted to be a pilot, and I wanted to be an airline pilot. So I got my pilot's license, and during that process, I ended up getting the same girlfriend. I ended up getting her pregnant. So, bought a house right next to my hometown, which is now my hometown is White Lakes, Minnesota. And actually, my son is the mayor now, the same child that was born when I was in college.
Congratulations! That's cool.
one of the youngest mayors in Minnesota history. So that's really awesome.
That's pretty sweet.
But I took a job working in our local mine, and it shut down almost as soon as I started. So we have a town of 2,000 people that had 2,000 people working in that mine, plus thousands of spin-off jobs too. So it's just a devastating thing for our economy here. But anyway, I was actually one of the last people ever hired at this mine near my hometown, and it's actually both my grandparents' fathers retired from there. And it went on a hiring freeze just the day before, a couple days before I was to start in the actual mine. So I actually ended up working in the guard gate, and that's how I worked as a security guard there for about a year. And then when I left, I got some dislocated worker money, and I went and got a master's degree. And that's actually how I could only take so much, and so I picked counseling. It's like, I really like the social sciences, and I took a job working in mental health at that same time while I was getting my master's degree, and just fell in love with the field. I'm like, this is my home. And about as soon as I got my master's degree, I got a job teaching at a community college or junior college, teaching psychology classes, and I decided I wasn't done with school. So I was working in mental health at that same time, and I saw a lot of people that were in the mental health system also had criminal records, but they weren't criminals. They were getting in trouble for quality of life types of crimes, trespassing, stealing food, drugs, those types of things. So I decided to get my doctorate in criminal justice, and I wanted to help those people. So I ended up, becoming a licensed therapist. So, and that's where I'm doing a lot of these criminal justice things as a licensed therapist. I got a little ahead of myself, but I worked as a prison therapist for a while, and then I taught for psychology for I think 16 years, and then the last 2 years I taught with a criminal justice department at a university. So I've been all over the place with criminal justice, and a lot of it had to do with, I initially got into it too. I had a strong interest in like kind of the criminal mind type of stuff, like a lot of people do. It's like, I want to be a forensic, like a forensic psychologist or a criminal profiler.
Profiler,
really, and there's really no jobs, and I mean there are jobs, but not many. I mean you're moving, and you got to get real lucky to get those jobs. But then that's kind of when I found like, the people with mental illnesses really, are struggling, and they're way overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and I really saw that as a disservice, because these people are being, basically punished for their mental illness, and that's not right. So that's really how my career started.
It's crazy. I mean, I love the fact that, I don't love it, but like in terms of it's such a good message for kids who maybe are not like super academic in like, their elementary school or primary school, into their high school even. And, not to say that you didn't have the ability, it's just maybe the interest wasn't there, you're into sports and stuff, but to translate that into, a career that you have now where you have like PhD and done all the things that you've done. And it's an amazing sort of like, it's an unusual case. You think that if you're not academic at school, that's the way it's going to translate the rest of your life, but it's not the case.
And it's really helped in counseling, because I things happen for a reason. I feel like I've gone through a lot of hardships in my life, and And that was definitely one of them, as I really struggled in school. I didn't even try in school. But when it came to classes such as history class or social civics or, those types of classes, I really excelled. One of my, actually, I was thinking about this today, preparing for coming on this podcast. And I remember being I was in high school, and I had to take a class because my schedule didn't match up. So I ended up taking this extra class where about 10 of us were in this class. And basically all we did was write papers. And that was the first time I ever really had to write any lengthy papers. So I did a paper on the Vietnam War, and I did a paper on the Old West, like cowboys back in the Old West in America here. And my teacher, and this was like a compliment, my teacher accused me of cheating. So I was a pretty good writer, and I had a strong interest in that type of stuff back then, as I do now. But because most of my grades were really bad, they just figured I cheated, and I didn't. So like, well, thanks for the compliment.
Wow, that's crazy. It's just basically there was something that needed to hit upon within you to like spark that interest, and then it would just explode and blossom and groom. That sort of writing aspect of your ability. That's amazing.
Yeah. Actually, not too many years ago. So I've been out of school since 1996, out of high school, and I ran into one of my teachers. He actually recognized me, and he said, "Hey, Scott." My last name's Scott. Scott, you're Scott. You used to like Indians, didn't you? Because he remembered how much of an interest I had in Native American culture back then. Well, fast forward now, the last 6 years, I've been working part-time as a therapist for a Native American reservation. So,
oh, wow.
It's kind of weird how your early interests, still...
they still carry on through
impact you later
through
on
life.
Yeah.
And we will definitely go into, I guess, your interest in dark tourism and stuff. And before we jump into that, I love that there's an aspect of things with, dark tourism. I guess to define that for people, it's kind of places in the world that have, a dark history. There's a real heaviness, there's tragedy or war or other aspects of things that are not usually people would go on holiday to go and see. You've obviously got an interest in these darker places, whether it's the dark tourism side or the criminal mind side of things, that get you interested in your academic career. Yeah. What is it about the darker side of humanity that really sort of like fascinates you?
I think how people got to act in deviant ways really is fascinating, because some people it's truly, I don't really believe in people are born evil. I think everyone's made evil, but some people have just more the brain structure. So when they have early childhood trauma or later in life, they might have an assault that happens or they get into booze or addictions. And, so there's many pathways into criminal behavior. And it really, that type of stuff really fascinates me. And actually within dark tourism, prison tourism is considered dark tourism. So going to Alcatraz, or over there in England, they have the Clink prison. We have the Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. So those are all dark tourism spots. Yeah, so there's a lot of criminal justice you can do within dark tourism.
Nice. Well, on this podcast, I always love people to come on and share a significant story, the most standout story of their career. And what I love about your story is that, we've been talking about dark tourism, for a minute, and people are probably wondering like, well, that's a tourist thing. That's not a career. That's not a part of your career thing. But I'd love you just tell us, because I know that the dark tourism has fed into your career, and just tell us a story about how all of that came to be.
Yeah, so ever since I was a kid, one of the great things my parents did is traveled a lot. So we traveled all over the United States. They had an interest in history, so that's partially probably where my interest came. So we stopped at a lot of museums and historical markers and things like that. So as I got older, ended up getting married, and we traveled a lot, and we'd start going. We actually, my very first time I got involved, maybe what I would consider dark tourism, would be when I was in Key West at Sloppy Joe's bar, which is where Hemingway's favorite bar was. Yeah, that was Sloppy Joe's. So we were sitting there, and it was our first day in Key West, and we were talking to a local, and he said, "You should check out the local cemetery. It's really quirky. You wouldn't think of a cemetery as a tourist spot, but you should check it out." So we did check it out, and the epitaph said, a lot of funny things like, devoted fan of Julio Iglesias, and I told you I was sick, and things like that, where it was quirky, and they're above ground, and there's chickens roaming around. It was just a really interesting cemetery. So we actually ended up going, every time we went somewhere, we would go to cemeteries. So, Paris, we spent a lot of time in the cemeteries, and the Père Lachaise, especially, where Jim Morrison and Frédéric Chopin are. And then the Paris Catacombs, been down there a couple of times.
Yeah.
And those are amazing experiences. And what I found is that I kind of went there as more of a tourist to some of these places, but what I found is the more I went to these places, the more I wanted to go to these places, and the more I got out of these places. And I think kind of on a subconscious level, I started taking it really serious. And I think when I really started doing that is, so I ended up having a disease called vasculitis, which Harold Ramis from the Ghostbusters died of vasculitis. And I had just a series of autoimmune issues. And then in the middle of that, my wife left me, and I could go on and on about all the crap I went through during that time, but I was absolutely rock bottom in my life. I started drinking too much. I, really was struggling. And what I found is I did a lot of tourism. I seems like when times have gotten hard for me, I've gotten an airplane and just went, or got in my own plane, because I'm a pilot and I like to fly places. But I found myself in a lot of dark tourist places. So, and then fast forward a couple of years later, I ended up getting liver disease. And I probably have had it for many years, but I was finally diagnosed. And when I was diagnosed with end-stage liver disease, severe cirrhosis. And I might, they weren't sure how long I would live or if I would need a transplant. God. And I ended up in the hospital because my brain got poisoned with ammonia because my wasn't filtering and but anyway, so I started recovering from that. I started getting really healthy. I had quit drinking a long time before that, and but it was an autoimmune liver disease, and just like the drinking amplified it. And so anyway, I started going to, again, a lot of dark tourism places. So I did a lot of tourism within about a year and a half's time when I was healthy enough but still sick. So I had gone to where did I go? I had gone to, Germany, there are a ton of dark tourism in Berlin, Auschwitz, Poland, Egypt. And then I went to Jerusalem and actually wrote a big, about a half a chapter in my book is about Jerusalem and how, there's a lot of darkness in Jerusalem. And, and you're going there to reflect on the suffering of Christ and the death of Christ. And you go into his tomb. I mean, there's a lot of, dark things, and obviously the fighting that goes on over there. And so what's also interesting is dark tourism. There's a strong overlap. And what I found, and this is kind of where the psychology of it comes in, is what I found is that, and I've gone to a couple of religious places like the Vatican and I've gone to all these dark tourism places, and there's such a strong overlap in the reflections a person gets. So when you're going to, especially the darker types of places, you're standing on hallowed ground, where blood has spilled and people have suffered, people survived through horrible things. I mean, and when you're going to religious places, you're looking at the big picture too, is like, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of things? What happens after you die even, and you get those reflections at both those places. So what I found is when I was going through my liver disease, when I was before my liver disease, when I was sick with the vasculitis and still married, I had profound anxiety, and I had anxiety probably my whole life, but it really came to a peak. So I'm a therapist, and I really suffered. I didn't want to get help. I didn't want to lose my pilot's license. I didn't want to, kind of admit that I had a problem. And that's really why my wife left. It was because of my anxiety. It wasn't probably because I was physically sick. It was more my anxiety.
Yeah.
So I just kind of pushed her out the door with that. And what I found, though, is going to these dark tourism places when I was going through what should have been objectively the hardest time of my life is when I was dying of liver disease. If people are familiar with Stoic philosophy, where it's, you control what you can, but if you can't control something, you have to accept it. And going to dark tourism spots really helps you to become a true Stoic. And I think that's what really helped me, because some people might be familiar with the term memento mori. So memento mori is a Latin phrase meaning remember, you must die. It came from Roman generals where they had have a parade and people would follow the generals around and they would whisper into their ear when the general gets too cocky, memento mori, remember, you must die, kind of to humble the general. But during the Victorian era and the Elizabethan era, Christians used it as a call to remember to live. So it's remember you must die as a call to remember to live and to remember to live with purpose. So when you go to, religious pilgrimages or dark tourism spots, they both do that same type of thing. So that's really where, when I went through the liver disease, it kind of just came to my awareness, like, oh my God, these places really helped me. And I needed to tell people about that.
It's amazing. You just mentioned pilgrimages there, and I'd never thought about going to somewhere like, Auschwitz or, the Paris Catacombs as a I guess a religious pilgrimage, but it's almost like a psychological pilgrimage and a journey that helps you go on a mental journey, of sorts. And I can only, I've done the Paris Catacombs, for example, and that has a real aura to it, in terms of, especially when you're surrounded by tens, hundreds of thousands of skulls.
6 million people are buried in the catacombs, yeah.
And it's probably visually one of the darkest places you can go, because you're just literally seeing death. You're surrounded by dead people. But I've also been to...
What's really interesting, though, is I don't think it's that scary. I mean, I suppose for some people it might be a little scary, but, it's really just... It's like every person in there had a name. Somebody loved them. They had a job. They had, and they had pets. They had, and it's just like when you get on the other side, you're like, wow, that, that's going to be me in not too many years. It's like, I got to live, And you really, it's really a call to live. It is a memento mori. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, it's all right. And I do agree. Like I wasn't necessarily scared, but I was fascinated by it. Because you're not often exposed to that level of, confronted by that level of like reality. And as you say, it's memento mori. You're surrounded by 6 million dead people, and you're forced to think about it. But I mean, one of the other places I've been very fortunate to visit is Chernobyl and Pripyat, the town next to Chernobyl, and going there, and you've got an entire town, 50,000 people lived there and were evacuated within less than 2 days, and they just dropped everything. And the fascinating thing about that place is that it is a location frozen in time. It's sort of like it's a snapshot with people's like breakfast dishes still on the tables, but at the same time you've got a tree trunk growing up through the middle of the kitchen floor because it's been there for 30 years and hasn't changed. And it's a humbling thing, and I love the things that make you feel small, in that sense, and in that sense. So,
well, there's an interesting thing where I've tried to compare dark tourism to other things. So I would compare it maybe to psychedelics. So I talk about how I walk through the gas chamber. There's one gas chamber at Auschwitz that's still standing. So you walk down the same steps that thousands, men, women, children walk down, and I remember my tour group walked into the next room. And I'm standing in this gas chamber by myself and just thinking of where I was, and you can just picture people falling one by one, and you see the places where they had throw the canister, the Zyklon B down, and scratches on the walls and things like that. And then you walk into the next room, and then there's rail tracks going to the furnaces. They called them ovens. And, and then you think of the Sonderkommando, which is the Jewish people that were forced to throw their own kind into the furnaces after they died. And then you walk out the other side, and you're thinking like, this is like the industrial scale. It's like we all have heard of the Holocaust, and we kind of get a picture of it. But until you're standing in there, and I mean, you feel the Holocaust. When you go through any of these dark tourism spots, especially the ones that have, that are more profound, you feel those places. Whether it's a psychic energy or, coming from your own mind and your own brain because you know of where you're at, or is it a truly a mystical type of energy? I don't know. But you come out that other side and you realize you're a changed person. And some of those places, when I went through Hiroshima, it took days before the dust really settled and I could really understand kind of the meaning behind my visit there. And because it was so emotional going through there, just the guilt of as being an American going through there. I mean, we nuked two civilian cities,
Take us through that experience when you went to Hiroshima.
Yeah, so the very first room you go into, once you get into the museum, there's this long mural. And it's a beautiful ancient city. You see all that beautiful ancient Japanese architecture and all these buildings. And then when you get to the end of the mural, there's a life-size picture of a class where, it was taken, right around the time where the bomb dropped. So it was maybe 10, 11-year-old kids in this picture, and they're in uniforms. As I'm walking through with kids that are probably in that same age group. And then they're standing in front of that mural, looking at the mural, and it just looked like a mirror image. And then on the wall right next to them, the clock is stopped at 8:15, which is the time the bomb dropped. When the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And then you walk into that next room. It's the same exact mural, except nothing. It's all complete destruction. And and what a experience walking through there with those school children, and there wasn't too many Caucasian white people, probably Americans. I mean, it was mostly Japanese people in that museum, and you just it's story after story after story of just heartbreak and devastation, and you're like, is this ever gonna frigging end? And is this ever gonna get better? Is it? And it never does. It does end, but it just keeps going on and on. It just felt like a gut punch over and over and over and over. It talks about how they drank the black rain because they were so thirsty, and then that was nuclear fallout. They were dying and most of them died of cancer within weeks of the bomb.
Radiation sickness, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just a profound experience. And leaving there, I think I was in such shock and just horror. And it took several days for that experience to okay, I feel okay now. But the thing is, and same thing goes with therapy. And this is where I use, dark tourism therapy a little bit, is in therapy, a lot of people avoid coming to therapy because they don't want to face the darkness. They don't want to face their trauma. They don't want to talk about their stressors because it makes them real, And that's exactly how you get to the other side of it is by confronting it. And I think as society, going to dark tourism spots helps us confront, these horrors in the world. And when you do that, you're living we have the saying, never forget. I think a lot of countries have that same saying. And in America, we really try to believe that. And going to these places, you're living the never forget. You're embodying it. And, what's kind of cool about that, if there's, there are good things that come out of dark tourism. I guess that's why I wrote my book. And you get these, so when you go in with a lot of reverence, and that's what I advocate for, what I call reflective dark tourism. So you go in there with the intention to reflect on the people that went through there, their suffering, their accomplishments, you just try to really go in with a lot of reverence and a lot of empathy. And when you do that, especially when you're empathized, a mirror emerges, and little pieces of yourself you can see within those places. And you're not doing it to compare your life against theirs. You're doing it, it's impossible to, if you really truly try to empathize, it's impossible to not. That's why we watch documentaries, so we can empathize with the stories. And the same thing going through dark tourism spots. You see little pieces of yourself in there. And what kind of is cool is when you are going through your own hard time, and this is where what I wasn't expecting. So when I was going through the darkest times, when I was getting the calls to go down for my liver transplant, and one of them was a false alarm where I didn't get the liver and I had to go home after staying in the hospital for a couple of days, and my dark tourism experiences really came back to help me through those hard times. You just don't feel so alone in your suffering because you've seen suffering, not firsthand seeing it, but you're at those places where there was suffering, and if you go in with that empathy, you do kind of see it, and it really absorbs into it actually goes into a different place of your brain than just regular memories. So emotional memories are more in your limbic system, in your hippocampus, where other memories, they just kind of randomly go wherever they go. But so you can think of, the most emotional times in your life. You remember them pretty well, and we've a lot of us experienced, when the Challenger crashed or 9/11, those types of things. When Kennedy died, that was before my time, but a lot of people that were around then, they know exactly where they were when they heard the announcement that Kennedy died. So we all have these times in our life, and dark tourism sort of does that same thing.
It's really interesting. Like I'm a scientist, sort of molecular biologist, sort of by education,
Okay.
but there's almost like a sort of psychological equivalent of like inoculation to some degree. And let me explain what I'm thinking here, because there was a study with during COVID, I think, that basically said that people who loved watching horror films had essentially, long story short, coped better with the fact of lockdown and all of this difficulty and all that kind of stuff. And, it's similar to what you're saying there with like, the more that you go to these darker places and you're confronted with it, it's almost like you have this slight protection or inoculation against the darkness that you may experience in your own life. Would you agree with that?
100%. 100%. I talk a lot about how I was never tested in my life. I mean, I had ups and downs and went through, I might have had PTSD when I was younger whatever. But, I really never faced anything that was hard until I ended up getting really sick and my wife left, and then I went to these dark places, and until you really have, and that's where I'm kind of feel fortunate as a therapist that I've gone through a lot of darkness in my own life, is because it helps me to help other people. And I think when you have gone through your own darkness and you've actually done the reckoning, because when people can go through their own darkness, or watch films or go through museums, and if they just kind of stay within their comfort zone, so maybe it's not, people might go through Auschwitz and they don't really try to empathize, they just read the plaques and try not to feel emotional as they go through there, they don't get a whole lot out of it. So but if you go in and really try to step in their shoes as much as you can as being a tourist, you come out with profoundly changed. And then the same thing was, there's, what I was getting at earlier is there's things such that are similar to dark tourism. And I think, psychedelics might be one way of changing yourself really quickly. Astronauts talk about the overview effect, where they're up and they look down on Earth and they see how small they are in the universe. And they're just this like speck of sand on a giant beach, basically. And it just changes their whole life, just that perspective. Having a loved one die, having a illness like I had, can be life-changing. And, so there's certain life-changing things. But I also think that a spiritual pilgrimage as well as a dark tourism pilgrimage, can be very life-changing if you go in with that right intention.
Interesting. And in terms of your practice dealing with patients and stuff, like, you're working with someone who's dealing with anxiety or depression or whatever, would you write them a prescription for, hey, go to Auschwitz or go to the catacombs? Like, how does it translate into your therapy work?
Well, it all, I dark tourism as a therapy method is not a researched thing. There are studies of people that have had psychological difficulties who have gone to dark tourism places, actually ended up getting more out of it than a person who wasn't having difficulties. So, I mean, there are studies that show that, dark tourism can give you these, like a lot of things that I'm talking about. But as a therapy method, no, it's not something that I would prescribe per se. But it is something I talk about, where if there's parallels, I'll bring it up. depending on the situation. I'm not talking to a 10-year-old about Auschwitz necessarily, but but I might about Anne Frank. I mean, so it depends on the situation and the person. But yeah, it gives a lot of stories you can, relate to some of their situations.
Absolutely, yeah. I guess when it comes to seeing and thinking about dealing with the criminal minds you've dealt with and people with mental illness in your day-to-day therapy stuff, and confronting with the darkest things that humans have done, how has it changed just your overall view of humanity, or maybe not at all?
Yeah, you go to those places and you're not only walking in the footsteps of evil, and how, and every situation is a little bit different. But going to a place like the Whitney plantation in by New Orleans in Louisiana in the United States here. So that's a plantation where they talk about slavery from the slave's point of view. But when you look at it through the slave's eyes, you can really see how awful the people were, and that's the point of it. It helps you to become much more emotionally intelligent, I think, if you when you go through these things with reverence and empathy.
Absolutely. And you'd mentioned earlier, and this is kind of getting a little bit to the light you just mentioned, to some degree, the lighter side of things, but well, maybe not. We'll see. The mystic and the psychic side of things, like, you've been to all these places, and a lot of people would say, oh, this place is haunted, and where do you sit on that spectrum?
It's interesting because I've gone to many haunted places. Like I said, I just went on this haunted tour around Mesa recently. Back in May, Lizzie Borden was a famous case here in the United States in the 1800s, where the Lizzie Borden house, she allegedly murdered her father and stepmother with a hatchet. And it became kind of the O.J. Simpson case of the 1800s, where did she do it? Did she not? And she ended up being found not guilty. But this place is called the Lizzie Borden House, and a lot of people think she did it. And so anyway, I went there and I went on the tour, and then after the tour was over, I got to stay in the house, and I was in the house by myself for a few hours. And I ended up staying. I spent the night at the Lizzie Borden house, and I slept in Lizzie Borden's bed, and I've never experienced anything that I can say for sure this is paranormal. But you feel an energy in those places. And again, is that my own psychic, within my own brain type of energy? I will say, though, I did have one, I don't consider it a paranormal experience, but it's definitely makes you wonder. But I was at the Vatican, and it's, they have this thing where it's like, hey, if you go to the Vatican, you're blessed by the Pope, which I was, you're covered for 3 months once you go back home. It's like, okay, whatever. Nice. Didn't really believe it. Didn't think about it. But anyway, within a couple of months, I was driving to work, and it was really, really foggy out, and you couldn't see. And I leave for work around the same time, so I was, I was driving too fast for the conditions, and I had never heard a voice in my life, out, in my own head. A lot of people that I work with, with schizophrenia or serious depression or so, they might hear voices but anyway, I heard a voice in my head. It said, Chad, slow down. There's a car coming at you. And that freaked me out. And it felt really, it felt spiritual in nature. And the first thing I thought was the Vatican and God and Jesus and things like that. And I'm not even all that religious. But that was my thought. Like, oh my God, that was not my own thought. That was a voice in my head. And I slowed down to about half the speed. I was scared because after hearing that, it's like, oh my God, that was crazy. And within 20 seconds, sure enough, there was a car flying at me in my lane. Had I been going that same speed, I guarantee there would have been, several fatalities, because the other car, it ended up pulling over after I swerved off, and it pulled over, and a car behind that pulled over, and we just look at each other, and usually I'd be like yelling out the window, cussing them out, and I just felt this like peace, like, oh my God, that was profound, So
wow,
that's the closest thing to anything paranormal I've ever experienced.
Yeah, that is a weird one. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you say there like about the voice in your head, and as you say in your practice, you might deal with people that say, "I hear voices in my head,"
Yeah.
and did you think maybe I feel like what a schizophrenic feels like, or do you maybe have more empathy towards schizophrenics who have voices in their head, or how has that changed your view of working with patients like that?
I don't think that actually that right there changed it at all
Yeah,
because I don't know, because that was the only time I ever experienced it. It was just that short little blurb. And sure enough, there was a car coming at me, and I
yeah,
haven't heard it
it's
since.
validated. Yeah,
And it's like, but had I heard something like that all the time, and there's things we do as therapists to sort of empathize with people with schizophrenia or hear voices. So you can roll up a piece of paper and just kind of say things really quietly in somebody's ear, and it gives the sensation of hearing voices,
wow,
and then there's things where you can put a whole VR type of thing where you go through these VR scenarios and you're hearing voices and trying to, get your medication from a pharmacy, and and you have this VR thing and you're hearing voices. And so, yeah, those things have probably been more significant when I've tried to empathize with people that hear voices.
yeah,
Yeah.
brilliant. I mean, for anyone that's listening that kind of has an interest in psychology, maybe wants to become a therapist, just generally, I always love guests to sort of give some advice for people that want to follow in their footsteps, or maybe even the dark tourism aspect of things.
Yeah. So an interesting thing is my very first year of college, I had to take something called career explorations, and they had us do a career inventory test. And at that time, again, I was going to be a gym teacher, and maybe if I did good enough grades, I'd be a pilot. And okay, so those are the things I was looking at. So I came up. The two things that came up highest was a therapist or a counselor, and a college professor. And I'm thinking like, there is no way I would be either one of those things. This thing couldn't be farther from the truth, And those are the two things I became. And it's like, and those careers really chose me. I didn't even choose those careers necessarily. I just,
Yeah.
it seemed to just fall into place. And so for people that want to possibly get into psychology, talk to people that work in the field. There's many avenues. You don't have to get a PhD. You can work in the field, with a high school degree. In some cases, working in a group home, as long as you have a good criminal record, and don't have a criminal record, I should say. You can work in places like that. You get a 4-year degree. You can work as, what I call bachelor's level counselors.
Yeah.
So, where they're case managers or outreach workers, things like that. And then you can get a master's degree and then start looking at being a therapist. And then if you want to go on, you can get a doctorate. And you can, and there's many different fields. It can be marriage and family therapy, which also gets you into the world. You can go into psychology, you can go into counseling, you can go into social work. If you go on the medicine side, you can become a psychiatrist or a nurse practitioner or things like that. So there's many avenues to get into the realm of mental health.
And what's it like I mean, from your perspective, in your particular, job at the moment, what's it like I mean, it must be incredibly rewarding, but it must also be, tough at times as well, dealing with, having to hear basically people's problems every day.
Yeah, yeah. I think early in the career that most people, that's when they struggle the most. Once you get past your first maybe 5 years, you just, at least for me anyway, and a lot of the people that I've supervised a lot of therapists over the years now. And, once they get past that, like almost like a culture shock, it's like, oh my God, the way people live and the way they have these symptoms, and like I couldn't imagine, once these horrible things that they had gone through, you hear about sexual traumas, and I mean, like you just hear everything. I've worked with several murderers, and you try to go home and to not think about those things, but it's impossible to not at times. And I think the farther I've gotten into the field, the more years of experience I have gotten, I think I've just learned to leave work at work a lot easier. And I don't know. I wish I could tell you exactly how I do that, but I've just learned how to do that. I think most therapists do that. I mean, a lot of us try to engage in our own healthy coping skills. And I guess that's really about all you can do, and talk to people. A lot of therapists have therapists.
I was about to say exactly the same thing. I know a lot of therapists tend to have also a therapist.
Yeah. Or a clinical supervisor where you can, especially when I've worked with the young people coming into the field, we call them pre-licensed therapists, or clinical trainees, they oftentimes struggle with that kind of stuff. And so that's part of our supervision is an ounce of counseling ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, carrying on from the advice side of things, if there was one, in terms of the dark tourism side of things, if there was one place, if someone could go to one, or people can go to one place in particular that had the biggest impact, what would you say that is for you?
For me personally, I would say, I don't know that I have I certainly don't have a favorite. There's places that have been more meaningful. So some of the places that have been, I think, really meaningful was Hiroshima and Auschwitz. I think partially is because like my grandfather fought in the war. I had a pretty big interest in World War II aviation, and so World War II is just more interesting to me than a lot of things. And so I think that had more reverence to me when I stepped into those places, but also places closer to home too, like the Whitney plantation, where the Little Bighorn. So where it was Custer fought, the Native Americans and going there and reflecting on, how horrible, because America, we think about like, oh, yay, it's fireworks and Revolutionary War. And, but we also enslaved a lot of people, and we tried to commit at least cultural genocide against Native Americans. And really knowing that, and I think this makes us more American to not bury those things, which I think some people want to just bury those and like never talk about them. And there's people actively doing that within government right now. So, those stories are just as important as the stories of how we beat the British, during the Revolutionary War, because, it's what makes us human. It's, it's like kind of the chimpanzees and apes and things. Jane Goodall, she said, you would think Jane Goodall's favorite animal was chimpanzees, but she says, no, it's dogs, because chimpanzees are too much like humans. They're some are evil, some are great, Yeah. But, yeah.
That burying that past thing is fascinating, because there's literally mountains of evidence. I'm sure you're more than well aware as a psychologist, a therapist, of burying your trauma, whether that's personal trauma or like civilizational trauma and history, never ends well.
Right. Right. So I think a lot of it is comfort zones. So I talk about comfort zones a lot in therapy, and this is where I do make an overlap between this and dark tourism. So people want to stay in their comfort zones. So, it's what feels safe. It's what's familiar, and people, when they go through a traumatic event, they tend to want to stay in that comfort zone. That's just human nature. Some people, it's alcohol is their comfort zone. So I mean, that's your comfort zone. But what happens is, in a comfort zone, over time, that comfort zone gets smaller and smaller, and that person's world gets smaller and smaller. And then when it gets smaller and smaller, the only thing that really grows in a comfort zone is anxiety, depression, and suffering. So on the opposite side of a comfort zone is what I call reckoning. And reckoning is hard work. It's going to therapy. It's going through dark places that maybe you're avoiding, such as that Whitney plantation, or going to, to the massacre at Wounded Knee or Little Bighorn and places like that, where, these awful things happened. But you're honoring the suffering of people, and you're going through the reckoning. And when you go through a reckoning, whether it's your own personal reckoning or the reckoning of more of these societal types of places that are significant in a nation or even in a world, that helps you to become more emotionally intelligent and to recover and to be more resilient and stronger. And, and that's why, both therapy and dark tourism help you to face darkness head on. And when you face darkness head on, that is the quickest way to getting through it.
Amazing. I think that's a perfect place to leave things off here, Chad. Thank you so much. It's a lovely final thought. I mean, just I always love at the end just to sort of give guests to say what you got going on, where people can find you, what you've kind of got put out in the world.
Yeah, so you can find me at drchadscott.com, and you have my contact information. I'm on Facebook at Chad Scott Author. My book is Beyond the Darkness. It's had these great critical reviews, and it's a audio book. You can get paperback or Kindle. You can get it at all the usual types of bookstores, especially the online ones. Kind of hit or miss whether it's in your local bookstore, but yeah, those are the main places, and I'm doing a lot of talking and podcasts and things. But I'll be at the Whitney Plantation, I think, in January, which is one of the places I write about in my book, which is a psychiatric museum. It was on State Lunatic Asylum number 1 or something like that, or 2. God. And that was. Yeah, and that's a great place. It's probably one of my favorite museums because it tells the whole history of mental health treatment for how it became so cruel, and then talks about the criminalization of mental illness. And Dorothea Dix, who's a hero of mine, who's a nurse that was in Boston, who, she was kind of the main reason why we have institutions, because she saw that a lot of people in jails and prisons were suffering with mental illness, and that's why they started incarcerating people. And then in the 50s, they had the de-incarceration, so... Then they go back into the jail again. Yeah. And just on your book, just give us a very quick sense of because we talked a lot about stuff that you've written in your book, but the book itself is it's sort of like an your personal experiences. You visit these various places and give us a sense of what the book's about. So I'd say it has some layers to it. So the first layer is a memoir. It's my story of how I got into dark tourism and how it really impacted my life, and how, when I went through my own really dark times, how dark tourism helped me get through those hard times. But it's also, I talk about 70 different places around the world that I've been. And I talk about, I really try to write in a way where I'm kind of like your tour guide in your eyes and ears, and telling my story going through them, but you're vicariously living through me walking through them. So it's sort of like you're getting a tour of all these places. But I'm also talking about my own reflections going through them, and then you'll see in the book how those reflections come back to really benefit me, and how I feel like, and one of the main things of going through these places too is you feel like you're carrying the torch for people that suffered, so they didn't die in vain, so that their story lives on. And when you do that, I think they gift you by giving you those reflections to where it helps you get through your own hard times.
Absolutely. Chad, listen, it's been absolutely fantastic speaking with you, man. And
thanks, Chris.
I love the conversation.
Yeah, thanks. I've enjoyed it too, Chris. Thank you so much.
And that is a wrap on this week's episode. A huge thanks again to Chad for sharing his stories and experiences with us. And of course, a big thanks to you all for listening and watching as well. If you'd like to dive deeper into Chad's work or check out his book, Beyond the Darkness, you'll find all the links in the show notes or on our website, noordinarymonday.com. And as always, you can find extra clips and visuals from this episode across our socials. We're on Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and there's also the No Ordinary Monday community page on Facebook, where you can join the conversation and share your own thoughts about the show. Next week's guest is Dr. Peter Neff, an Antarctic scientist, ice core expert, and TikTok science communicator with over 225,000 followers. His work takes he and his team into some of the harshest conditions on Earth, from whiteouts to tents being buried by storms to hunting for clues about Earth's past in tiny bubbles of air trapped in ancient ice, some of it dating back millions of years. And those bubbles may hold the key to understanding our climate's future. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on the episode. If you enjoyed today's show and feel like doing your nice deed for the day, take a few seconds and leave a 5-star rating review or tell a family member or friend about the show. You have no idea how much it helps us. With your support, we can grow the podcast, attract more extraordinary guests, and inspire new listeners. And that's it for this week. This show is independently produced, hosted, and edited by me, Chris Barron. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great Monday, everyone, and we will see you next week.